Britain's towns and cities grew rapidly in the 19th century, the Industrial Revolution fueling urbanization, the rise of factories, foundries and docks, and a sea of cheap and hastily constructed housing to accommodate workers. But this didn't mean affordable rents, and if you could afford a room at all, let alone a house, it was likely to be overcrowded, if not with your own family in cramped conditions, then shared with lodgers. This wasn't a time when tenants had any kind of legal protection for basic housing standards, and for unscrupulous landlords, the only incentive that they had was to pile up rooms with as many people as possible and collect their money. If you had any concern about your squalid conditions, you would be told that it was cheap, and if you didn't want it, someone else would. Your only remedy was to move out. But if you were poor, you were already struggling to pay the rent money on the hovel you were suffering to endure, could afford nothing better, and had nowhere else to go. Today, in an account by George Hall, a contemporary writer on living conditions in London, you will discover the appalling housing conditions suffered by the working classes in Victorian London. Find out how the capital was so overcrowded that people couldn't afford even to rent a single room, living in a half a room, screened from another family by a mere sheet. Worse still, if your pockets weren't deep enough to afford even that, then you could resort to renting a timeshare of a bed on a relay system, or, if you were very poor, a space under a bed. Imagine sleeping under the bed of a stranger. It's hard to believe, but such were the horrific conditions the very poorest endured, when small houses, no better than hovels, might be occupied by 40 people and a room by 10 or more. But if you had nowhere else to go, except the streets or the workhouse, perhaps sleeping under a bed was, for some, the lesser of two evils. Before we move on, if you're interested in history like this, and you want to find out more about what life was really like for people in the past, please consider subscribing for more content. If you'd like to support what we make for you, check out the description for links to ways you can help us continue bringing the past alive. Next to the houseless, among the victims of overcrowded London come the half-housed. If many people cannot get houses at all, many more, having got them, are only half-housed at that. Better to be without houses at all than to herd in houses in such an overcrowded state that vice, filth, crime, disease, and death follow of a certainty. For what are many of the houses in which so many of our people crowd and stew? They are hovels, not homes, death traps, not dwelling houses. Brick boxes with slate lids, as Mr. John Burns describes them. That anything born of an egg and invested with wings should have got to the pass that it hops contentedly down a ladder and calls that going home, was a circumstance so remarkable to Charles Dickens, so he tells us in one of his playful sketches on street fowls, as to leave one nothing more in this connection to wonder at. But there is something more to wonder at, and that is that human creatures can hop down ladders into cellars, as they do in parts of central London, and up ladders through trapdoors as they do in parts of East London, and call that going home, because they have no better place to go. Sad enough, but true. Before you get to the state of absolute houselessness, such as is now spreading throughout London, you first pass through stages of overcrowding that are simply appalling. Nay, the extent of the overcrowding is incredible. Were I simply to state the bare facts, without authorities to confirm what I say, you would probably be loath to accept them. It is not of the East End alone I speak. The plaint of the overcrowded is heard all over London. You find the houseless and the half-housed in every quarter of our city, and some of the worst cases lie outside the East End. That all the poor live in the East and all the rich in the West is, like many another trite saying, untrue. All over London, but chiefly in that great inner belt, lying between the city and the suburbs, you get all the evils of overcrowding and poverty in acute form. This inner belt is London's saddest picture. Look at the great grey streets and shabby habitations that lie east, west, north and south, all in unmoving monotony, and tell me anything more saddening if you can. The slums are sickening, we all know, and the block dwellings often more like warehouse than homes. But the mazes of interminable, mean streets inhabited by the hordes of labourers and poorer mechanics are more depressing and fuller of despair. No matter what part of London it be, whether Westminster or Whitechapel, Bermondsey or Bethnal Green, St. Luke's or Soho, Hoxton or Holborn, Limehouse or Lambeth, you get the same sombre aspect in the long, dingy rows of brick and tile and plaster that men call houses. If, as Ruskin claims, the architecture of a place represents the ideals of its people, who can wonder at the drab, hopeless lives of so many working Londoners? The architecture of their streets and homes is as the architecture of a wilderness. The grey, serried streets, the overcrowded dwelling places, sordid and dull, that go to make up this packed inner belt of London, form one of the most awful features of our city's life. Wise old Dr. Johnson saw this a century ago. If you wish to have a just notion of London, says he, you must not be satisfied with seeing its great streets and squares. It is not in the showy evolutions of buildings, but in the multitude of human habitations which are crowded together, that the wonderful immensity of London consists. It is this wonderful immensity that today has become tragic in its plea for room to live. Long ago, some of our people gave up hoping to inhabit a complete house, however small, and took to tenements. Long ago, some of them gave up tenements and took to single rooms. Long ago, some of them gave up even this scant privacy, and allowed adult lodgers to sleep in the same room with married people and children. Long ago, some of them gave up single rooms and became content with half a room, dividing the space by a sheet of sacking, with a family on both sides. We have seen also how some of them have had to give up their half-room and go to the workhouse. But it will probably be news to many that some of our people have begun to let even their very beds. Yes, houses and tenements and one-roomed homes have been divided and subdivided. Till now it has come to pass that the very beds are let off at so much rent. It is becoming common for night workers, such as bakers and watchmen, to rent a bed to sleep in during the day from people already living in an overcrowded state who occupy the bed at night. Among some families in Spitalfields, the beds are rented on the 8-hour principle, having 3 different sets of sleepers every 24 hours. Nor is this practice confined to these quarters. A few days ago, the Reverend J.E. Hand, who is on the executive of the London Reform Union, told me the conversation of 2 bricklayers' labourers as he overheard it travelling on the Underground. It was about 6 o'clock, and they were going home from work, destined for Chelsea. "Let's get out at Westminster," said one. "It's too early to go home yet. You know, the room I sleep in is occupied by a young woman all day who works on night duty at one of the big hotels. She doesn't get up till 7 o'clock to go to her work. Let's get out and go to the pub." There is another stage of overcrowding in which people not only sleep upon beds, but under beds. We will go to Kensington for our example this time. In a recent report of the Medical Officer of Health to the Kensington Vestry, the following paragraph appears. Overcrowding. 2 instances of this nuisance, lately come to light, are deserving of note. They are typical of a state of things probably not unusual in Nottingdale. On the 7th last, Inspector Stewart, accompanied by a police constable, visited a house in Kenley Street, shortly after 6 a.m. In one, furnished, room, having a cubic capacity of 1,000 feet, he found 5 adult females, the required airspace being 2,000 cubic feet, of whom 2 young women were hidden under the bed. At another house in Cerdar Road, 5 adults, 1 a man, and 2 children were found in one, furnished, room. In this case also 2 young women were found hidden under the bed. The airspace of the room is 1,650 cubic feet, the required amount being 2,400. The Sanitary Committee have directed proceedings to be taken against the several keepers and occupiers of the rooms, both of the houses being registered. The report goes on to say that such overcrowding is of frequent occurrence. This was hardly necessary to state after the passage quoted. If they didn't sleep under the bed, where could they sleep? When, for instance, we find a vestryman of a parish adjoining Kensington declaring publicly that there are single rooms in his district let at £1 a week, where as many as 12 people live, sleep, and work together. Where in the name of decency can the people sleep, if not under the bed? This, be it observed, is in St. James's, the parish of clubs and parks, the parish comprising the Mayfair district. The question appears to be fast approaching a climax, reports Bethnal Green Vestry, as, what with the insufficient house room and the enormously high rents now being charged, it is no longer within the means of working men earning ordinary labourers' wages to provide decent house accommodation. The result is overcrowding and indecency of an appalling kind. The other day, 17 people were found inhabiting a single room in Camberwell. Nor is it so long ago since a small house in central London was discovered with 31 people living in it. The local authority took the case into court, when the defendant told the magistrate that he got his living by letting houses. He might have added that people got their deaths by living in them, for the medical officer stated, in evidence, that the death rate of this particular house was equal to 129 per 1,000. A worse case was mentioned at the St. James's Hall the other day by the Reverend Hugh Price Hughes. Speaking on these papers as they appeared in the Daily News, he said one of his colleagues knew of a house not far from that hall, occupied by 43 persons. Continuing, he said, "In one room, a man, his wife and 8 children were found. In another room, horror of horrors, a man and wife and 7 children. The eldest son with a wife, and all herded together at night like animals. That was within 5 minutes' walk of St. James's Hall. Last week, walking through a street in that district, his colleague saw unnoticed, equally comic and tragic, a part of a room to let. He had long known that beds were let on the box and cocks principle, an arrangement where people make use of the same accommodation or facilities at different times. Not in comedy, but in grim reality. But the pressure had now become so great that beds were actually let on the 8 hours principle. 3 tenants in 24 hours, and miserable creatures slept both on and under the beds. There were many families in that neighbourhood who had never sat down together to a family meal in their lives. How could they, working, living, and sleeping in one room? Children coming from the board schools would ring the bell for their room, and the mothers would throw out of the window what was to serve as the children's dinner, and the children would take the food from the dirty paper, eat it in the street, and go back to school. At night, boys and girls perambulated the streets, waiting oft until midnight, until their parents came from the public house. Imagine how hard-pressed for want of room to live must have been the family of 5 whom Bermondsey Vestry found living in a loft over a stable. The family were promptly turned out, but they would only go and overcrowd some other hidden corner. Perhaps they were among the 10 people found shortly after by the same vestry living all together in a little back room, which was deficient in airspace under the public health regulations to the extent of 2,014 cubic feet. Now, these are facts. They are facts lying around us everywhere and facing us every day. But if these stray instances be facts, who shall say what the whole truth must be?